Hello, everybody. My name's Nick Lawrence. I'm from the Wild Trout Trust. I'm the Conservation Officer for the South and the Southwest of England. So although we're going to be talking about chalk streams today, I do cover non-chalk rivers as well. So I guess you could say, why am I being asked to talk about chalk streams and chalk stream management today? My whole career really has been based around fisheries and fishing. I graduated from Sparshall in about 2003 with a degree in fisheries management. So I have always been interested in fisheries. I've fished from a young boy. I caught my first trout on a chalk stream when I was about 7 years old on the River Avon. So I've always been interested in fish and fishing, and particularly rivers. I've always feel incredibly comfortable when I'm next to a river. It's just my happy place, really. And after I left Sparshall, I worked in the fishing industry. I was a fishing guide and river keeper and contract river restorer for 13 years. So I feel that's given me one side of the coin. And now obviously I work in conservation for the Wild Trout Trust. So that's giving me the other side of the coin. So I've seen commercial fishing and commercial fisheries, and then I've now gone to the more conservation side of things. So hopefully I can give a fairly balanced view on chalk rivers and how we manage them. What do we do at the Wild Trout Trust? We work with landowners, fishing clubs, wildlife trusts, rivers trusts, and we basically work out what's going on the river habitat wise. So that's kind of like the main area of our expertise is looking at the habitat and how that portrays into the fish populations. What fish need at various stages of their life cycle. So what specific niches of habitat are required for either small fish, juvenile fish, fingerling or parr, and then moving up to adult fish. Each of those stages, they need a very specific things. And obviously within a fishery, as you need those all to cover all those elements, otherwise you're going to end up with issues with certain stages of the life cycle. I'm going to look at what constitutes good fish habitat and what constitutes poor, and how to maintain the good habitat and how to improve the poor. Often on chalk streamers, there is a little bit of management required going forward, but it doesn't need to be as aggressive as you might see in some areas of maybe the Test, for example, because if you overmanage, you end up with some of the problems that I'm going to cover. And then later in the talk, I'm going to look into the catch and release and photography of fish. It's kind of an important thing as we're talking about fishery management. Catch and release is incredibly important if you're going to manage your fishery in a sensitive way. And I covered the photography side of it because it kind of meshes in with catch and release quite nicely. Whereas, you know, you need to handle your fish and respect the quarry so that somebody else can catch it. And I'll prove that later on with a few photos. So what is our approach, the WTT approach? As I talked about earlier, we work with fishing clubs, fishery managers, landowners. The normal protocol would be we get a call. Can you come and look at my reach of river? We're often funded to do this work, so it's often free as well. There's usually a small cost of my travel, for example, and then you get me on site. And so within that visit, we basically look at what's good and bad, pretty much. And that is often a good starting point as to come to recommend what to do when we possibly either write a report or we come in to recommend maybe a river restoration project. Often if the river's in a very poor state, we will recommend certain, you know, larger scale projects to obviously to kickstart some recovery to the river. We will identify bottlenecks in the population. So as I talked about earlier there, you've got life cycle of a fish. You've got the egg stage, you've got the alvin when they come out of the egg, then you've got the fry, the par, and then you've got the adult. We are looking, if your fishery or the reach of river we're looking at has areas for all those life cycles of fish. And if it has that, then obviously it gets a big tick. It may be just a case of this is absolutely fine, leave it alone. So those solutions we offer can be small, they can be big, it can be just maintain this by doing this and that kind of thing. And I'm gonna cover those solutions as we go through the talk today. And one of the other things we do, which is often after we've visited a reach of river, is we offer a practical day. So basically someone can say, right, how do I implement this stuff that you've recommended? So you've recommended to maybe place some woody material in the channel. How am I going to do that in the best way possible? Because obviously often when you suggest to do stuff and people have never done it before, the way they're looking at your report might come out slightly differently when they're implementing it practically, basically. So we can come along, train you in either some habitat management techniques. So for example, hinging trees, placing trees into the channel, where to place them, where not to place them. And also the most important thing is securing your practical work so that it doesn't disrupt somebody else and get washed out and end up in someone's hatches or in a mill or something that can go wrong if you're not trained in these techniques. Hopefully this diagram will show what I mean by a bottleneck, and obviously the bottleneck is where the bottleneck gets narrow. For example, if you're looking at the top right here, limited adult habitat, what that might mean is, you know, if I look at a reach of river and I say, well, actually it's quite good, but the adult habitat's limited, that may mean that there's very little pool habitat, so deeper water. Adult fish generally like a bit of depth over their backs. They don't generally like to sit in too shallow water. They also particularly thrive on cover. So that may be overhead cover, tree cover. So if you're looking at a reach of river and it's very shallow, for example, and it doesn't have many trees, that is probably going to be quite good for juveniles, but not so good for adults. So it may be, let's implement some tree planting to mitigate against the lack of adult habitat. Or it may be, let's try and create a bit more meanders in the system to scour big pools, which might hold adult fish. And maybe over those areas, we might plant some tree cover to make the fish feel more comfortable. The spawning habitat and the juvenile habitat, obviously, they can often go hand in hand, but the spawning habitat's particularly important, obviously, because if you haven't got spawning habitat, you're not producing any fish at all. Because if the fish can't access any spawning, or if there's no habitat for them to spawn in, you're going to have very, very limited numbers of fish. And they may well be just a few adults cruising around that maybe successfully spawn occasionally in certain areas. But spawning habitat as well, what's important to that is if, for example, you've got reasonable pool habitat, you've got good adult fish, but maybe there's a weir, for example, at the top of the fishery, and upstream of that weir, half a mile upstream, is the spawning habitat, you then have a problem that your fish aren't going to be able to get over the weir up to the spawning habitat to migrate to spawn. So you then end up with a bottleneck. We're going to briefly go into river health here. We like to use the three-legged bar stool. And obviously, if one of the legs of the stool is not supported, then the stool falls over and you don't get a healthy river. What we're going to do here is we're going to go through water quality, water quantity, and habitat. Talking about the water quality and quantity, we're not going to cover them so much today because the talk's about habitat. But obviously, water quantity and quality are incredibly important if you've got good habitat and you don't have those two, you've just got a reasonable habitat river, but the quality and quantity are poor. Water quantity often relates to abstraction of chalk streams, which again we're not covering, but obviously it's incredibly important to have that recharge in the system through winter rainfall to be able to give you that quantity of water. With global warming, that is becoming a little bit more sporadic. So even in respect of if you don't have abstraction on a river, the climate is incredibly important to recharge the river so that you gain your water back in it. So, for example, right now, at this point, our chalk streams are probably as low as they get. The aquifer is depleted. And now we're looking towards the winter to say, right, hopefully we're going to get a bit of rain, November, December, January, February, even into March. And that is going to recharge our river so that next summer we get good, stable flow on it. Obviously, if we have an incredibly dry winter, that water quantity is going to be very poor next year, and then that can have a knock-on effect on the river. And obviously, if your habitat's poor as well, then you get real big problems. The water quality obviously generally relates to pollution issues, so agricultural pollution, sewage, fish farming, cress farming, and then obviously habitat, which we're going to be covering today. The physical characteristics of a river are gradient, width, depth, and vegetation. Again, it relates back to the bottlenecking. If you have all of those factors covered, so you have good gradient, good width, and varying width of river, because what you don't want is a completely uniform river that is exactly the same width, exactly the same depth, and in a straight line, for example, because then you have a straightened river that just has no variety of habitat. So I think the key to think about with habitat is you want variety. You want fast flows, you want slow flows, you want deep bits, you want shallow bits, you want vegetation, you want trees. And then that's good habitat, basically, as long as you obviously don't have weirs and other things that come into it. But that is the sort of basis for good habitat. These 4 points are linked to the biological requirements of aquatic life. So basically, they're also not just linked to fish, they're linked to your invertebrates within the system as well. So if you have good overhanging vegetation, good trees that actually have fallen into the river and created niches of habitat, those are also going to be colonized by invertebrates. So in some ways, you could link it back to water quality. Oh, the water quality's got not good, but the habitat's poor. Well, if there's no habitat in the river, there's no things for the invertebrates to live on, which obviously is going to eventually be your fish food, because that's very, very important. And also the tree cover is often overlooked, particularly on chalk streams, because if you think of a chalk stream in your head now, what's it look like? It probably looks quite open, because a lot of them have been managed for fishing, which often means the trees have been cut down. So you do get this slightly skewed view of how a chalk stream should look, because it's been managed. And obviously all chalk streams are managed to a degree, and all chalk streams are basically man-made to a degree as well. But obviously that management means that the trees have often been taken away. And those trees are really important for not just shade with climate change, but also for invertebrates to complete their life cycle. So when they hatch out the river, they go and take shade, refuge in the tree. That can also give them a break from the wind and the weather, and they can complete their life cycle, come back, lay their eggs on the river, and then, the cycle starts again. But that's all, one of the points that's often overlooked, I would say, on chalk streams. And I've actually covered this point already, but migration of fish up and down the system. Often people think, oh, well, only salmon migrate, or all fish migrate. Every single fish in the river will migrate up and down the river to either find food, refuge, or spawning. And obviously, when they're out-competed out of an area, they have to move somewhere else. And if they can't move out of the system because of weirs or something else that's impeding them, then you can often end up with a bottleneck again. And again, I have slightly touched on this, but particularly chalk streams in the ways that they were very malleable. So they've been fashioned by man to be used for various things, and often most of that's been milling. Chalk streams have been straightened along the edge of the floodplain, moved to the side, often not where they should be, and they've been impounded. So got a dam or a weir or a mill that then builds up a head of water to run a mill. One of the best examples I can think of is the River Allen in Dorset. It's about 12 miles long, and it has a mill for every mile on it. So every mile there is a mill. And obviously that has had a huge impact on the habitat, basically, of the river, because it's often very, very straight. It's very deep, and those habitats are not that good for fish. You know, we link it back to the point one here. There's no variety. Obviously, a lot of the mills now are either derelict or gone, but often the structure of the mill, so the weir or the impounding hatches, are often still there. And that obviously creates a blocker to habitat development. Habitat has a huge impact on fish abundance. So what we're trying to get across is that variety. And that is really the key to having good habitat. What we have here is 2 trout sitting on a clean patch of gravel, spawning. What's interesting about this picture in particular is this patch of gravel is there because of habitat improvement work. You can see the bundle of sticks on the near frame of the screen here. They're called faggots. It's a bundle of sticks that's bundled together. It's used as a bank edge, a bank toe. So it's been pinned in by you can see there's some little fence posts there that are holding it in place. The bank has been lowered and graded behind those. And actually this work it's only about a month old at the time the fish are on it. So the habitat actually hasn't developed that much. So by habitat, I mean the marginal plants on the near bank here. You can still see little bits of chalk and gravel actually in the bank toe there. And obviously that will develop over time, and it will probably end up looking a bit more like the far bank there, where you've got probably some Norfolk reed. But this gravel was then placed in the channel because we had a very uniform channel. It was straight and box shaped, and there was no gravel for fish to spawn on. So the gravel's been actually placed in the river, and then a month later, fish have started using it and they're spawning on it. This kind of shows exactly what I've been trying to talk about, is if you don't have areas like this within a fishery where fish can go and they can spawn, and often, you know, if we want to talk about spawning, it's often the winter period, so December, January time, then you're going to have a bottleneck in the fish populations. If you don't have that up ramp or scour of gravel in the system, you're not going to be able to oxygenate the eggs. What this is attempting to show is that it's a fallen tree, and you have flow going underneath the log and over the top of the log. And what that is forming is a variety of flow regimes, which is scouring the gravel, which is producing good conditions for spawning fish. And then this next drawing in the little bubble here, bottom right, it's got fry, trout fry. Again, as I talked about earlier about vegetation and trees, and what that vegetation and trees provide is cover and refuge for fish. So think you're a fish that's, you know, a little bit longer than your eyelash. It's fighting the flow. It's a hostile environment. You've got things like kingfishers and herons that are keen to have a little snack. If you don't have lots of vegetation in the edges of your river or trees fallen into it, then these fish are very, very vulnerable. And so what this is attempting to show is that if you have nicely vegetated banks and trees that have fallen in, you're providing cover for those fish to go in, tuck away out the flow, and hopefully have a chance of avoiding some predation. And that's all it's about, really. You just need to try and have that balance between, yeah, of course, predators, they're an important part of the river system. But if fish haven't got places to hide, then they're going to get eaten a lot more than they could in a more natural river. And this last picture here, what this is attempting to show is adult habitat. So this is what this is showing is that you've got a really nice deep pool here. And again, you've got a collection of naturally drifted woody material. And obviously there's an undercut under there, so the fish can hide, tuck up under there. So if we're talking about predation again, for example, we'll talk about otters now. So the otter comes up the river. If you have a box-shaped river that's impounded and there's no trees and there's no marginal vegetation, he's going to find it a lot easier to catch a fish than if, for example, there's a trout near here, the otter comes up and he just dives straight into all that wood. He's probably not going to get caught by the otter. So what do we look for in a habitat survey? We look for things that are being done well. Are the fringes, the edges of the river being left alone? Are they trimmed in a minimal way? My preference is to have marginal areas not managed, so not cut at all. But obviously, you know, we're talking about fisheries management in this talk, and obviously sometimes there are elements that you do have to create some access for fishing. So it may be removal of a tree, it may be cutting an access area so fishermen can get in. Is there ample buffering from agriculture? So it's often cows or sheep are the main impacts. What we often look for is a 5 to 10 meter exclusion zone for agriculture. So if you have cows, sheep grazing right up to the edge of the river, you're going to impede tree development, you're going to impede marginal growth, you're going to have less flowering vegetation, and all those things that I've just said are good, you're going to stop happening. So often fences are important to create that oasis between grazing and non-grazing. There is an argument for having very small amount of animals on the bank that where you don't have fencing. I've never actually seen the perfect amount of animals where you could say, okay, there's like 3 cows in this field and they poach the bank in a sensitive manner and your habitats can still develop. It's very rare to find that because often it's 50 cows in a field for 2 or 3 weeks and they absolutely trash everything and then they're out and the damage is done. So I think it is important to have the fencing. The mowing and strimming. So again, we're talking about fisheries management. Should mowing and strimming take place? In my opinion, no, not really. It's better to have your habitats unimpeded by cutting, because if you're mowing, you're often suppressing important plant growth. If it's done too much, you can actually encourage erosion and things like that as well. If it is going to take place, it should take place very sensitively. Also, as the trees fall into the river, they should be left. It's quite hard to get this across sometimes in fisheries terms, because often people feel that every single bit of the river should be accessible with a fishing rod. And often, if that's the case, you probably have actually some poor habitat, because what that means is if you can access every single bit of the river with a fishing rod, that means probably the predators can too. You need those areas where no one can fish. They're really, really important to have areas where you've got full overhanging tree cover where actually no one can get to, because that means that the fish can go, do you know what? I don't want to be caught. I'm going to go in under here. And so you need those areas. They are very, very important. And what does a good reach look like? Well, I did manage to dig up a couple of pictures of what a good reach of river looks like. This picture here is of the River Piddle in Dorset. all the things I've talked about, hopefully you can see in the picture. So you've got lush marginal vegetation that isn't grazed. You've got flowering vegetation. You've got tree cover. What you also have are trees that have naturally collapsed into the channel. That, for example, at the top of the middle of that shot where the willow is overhanging the channel there, you have an area there where a fisherman can't fish to. But with fishery management, that is a good thing. If there is a big fish that lives under there, one day he might come out and you might be able to catch him. But often he might be tucked up under there, taking refuge. Also, what is notable about this picture is the lush weed growth in the middle of the river, so the ranunculus. Often we use that as a kind of a health check in a chalk stream. If you have lush ranunculus growth, you often have good gradient. So what that means is flow. So you have a good flow and you have a good gravel bed, which encourages ranunculus growth, which again is good refuge for fish and invertebrates. It's like a little food factory in there. So all your invertebrates are feasting on in and amongst the weed, and the fish are obviously either hiding in there or maybe sitting in behind it or munching shrimp on top of the weed. And so what you have here is actually a really diverse river system. Also, which is maybe not noticeable about the picture, is there is a bend in the river here. There's actually a meander. So the river is flowing towards us and then it's flowing off to the right. And so you have a kind of semi-natural chalk stream here where the river is not in a straight line. It is curving. There is an undercut bank here. For example, when I went to this bit of river, I did a report and the answer was, don't do anything, leave it alone. And my next picture is, this is actually in the Watercress and Winterbourne's area. This river is the Bourne rivulet, up at Hurstbourne Priors. This is in between Hurstbourne Priors and St Marybourne. Actually, there has been a river restoration here. Under the cress on the left-hand side of the picture there is actually a tree. The cress is colonised, obviously, after the project. But what that has done is squeezed the channel there, created the elevated velocity, given good conditions for ranunculus to grow again there in the middle of the river. So what things can be improved on? So again, if the mowing is taking place, is there too much mowing taking place? Is there too much strimming? Can that path be moved back away from the river? So often on chalk streams, you find a mowed path, and you could say often that path is mowed too close to the edge of the riverbank. Can it be moved back 1 metre, 2 metres, 3 metres to allow all those favourable habitats to develop, all the reeds, all the flowering vegetation, the meadowsweet, the flag iris? Are you suppressing those by mowing your path? And I don't know if any of you have got gardens as well, where you might have a bit of chalk stream in your garden. It's likened to a garden as well. You know, if you mow the edge of your river or trim the edge of the river, one, you're basically encouraging grass to grow, which has an incredibly short root, which again can encourage erosion, but also you're depleting your garden of biodiversity. Can trees be left as they fall into the river? When a tree does fall into a river, can you look at it in a different way to, rather than, oh, there's a tree falling in the river, I must remove it. It's creating really good habitat. So why remove the tree if the tree is falling in the river? And it goes back to often the fishery side of things. Oh, I need to be able to cast there. The fish love the refuge of the tree. The fishermen love to be able to fish the river. The fish will dive in under the tree. One day they might come out and you might be able to catch them. And actually what you're leaving there is actually a place where a fish is going to like to sit. And often if you remove that, the fish won't sit there. That's another important thing about how sensitive fish can be. You can literally trim 2 or 3 branches off a tree, and that will mean a fish won't sit there anymore. It means it will go somewhere else, because that's how sensitive they are about that really low overhead cover. Can fencing be erected? You know, again, if you've got cows that are trashing the channel, munching the ranunculus, creating sediment that goes into the river, Can you get fences up? Can you get the farmer on side? If there's no trees growing along the bank, we say, well, often there would be trees growing here. How about we get some solutions in so we can help you keep your cattle out the river? We can also help you maybe get some drinkers in place so the cattle don't need to go in the river. And then you can often come to an agreement where actually you can get the best of everything. Can branches stop being cut? I've covered that, and that is very important. Obviously, occasionally you do have to cut a tree. I'm not saying never cut a tree, but be very careful about the trees you cut, because they can mean that your fish will go elsewhere. And what do bad examples look like? I've got a few pictures to go through here. So this is on the River Itchen. What we have here is we have a lot of cows in the river, no fencing at all, and they are completely eroding the riverbank. You basically have no reeds, no flowering vegetation, just basically mud and flint, and no trees as well. If you were asking my opinion would be, let's get a fence up, let's maybe plant some trees or let it re-establish itself, maybe as part of a habitat project, and let's get some cattle drinkers in so we can stop the cows going in and trashing the habitat. And actually what's interesting about this site as well is about 50 yards downstream, you get salmon spawning. You've got salmon spawning downstream, and you've got this lot creating basically a minor pollution incident where they're in the river, they're defecating in the river, and then they're also eroding the bank, which is increasing the sediment loading of the river. This one here, obviously the river's very straight, for example, as well. So we've covered that, but what you have here is cattle. This is cattle. This is the Devil's Brook in Dorset, and this is fence now, actually. I haven't gotten after because the fence was only put up in the spring. What this is showing is when you have cattle in and out the channel, you basically got you've got a little bit of ranunculus there, but it's mostly degraded. The gravel bed's degraded. You've got no tree cover. You've got no reeds. You've got no flowering vegetation. And actually what you have also is no fish, because this was actually electrofished. I don't even think we found a bullhead. I don't think we found one bullhead. It was no fish at all. Took a while. We engaged with the farmer. He was not so keen to start with. Gave him a year or two. He came round. He now loves it. He thinks it's the best thing ever. So you just need to work with your landowner to engage in the right way, and often you can enact some good change on the river. This is actually done by people and dogs. This is on the Itchen. You have a footpath running here on the right-hand side of the river. And what you now have is sediment pollution into the river, and also a complete degradation of any plant that actually lived there. Obviously, you can see a few reeds there clinging on, but I give them a couple of years, they'll probably be gone too. So this is a tricky scenario here, because obviously you've got a footpath, and it's great that people can walk by the river, but what you also have is you have the river being degraded, and this is not just at one area, this is actually across this whole footpath area. There's a lot of areas like this, but it's very, very difficult to find solutions to stop this or reduce it or funnel activity to certain areas where you might have some erosion control, because often it's just very, very difficult to do. People feel that they need access to every single bit of the river. It's a bit like fishing in a way. They got the footpath, I can access the river. And so once you start to try and segregate them out of certain areas, obviously that can go down not so well. But I do have some instances later on of when that we have solutions for that, or a few solutions anyway. This is the river test. I think this was taken in about 2006, this picture. So what you have here is actually the river is impounded. So that's point one. There's some hatches here. So you can obviously see the gravel bed's not that clean. It's covered in sediment. You also have a mown path very, very close to the river's edge. And the fringe has been cut. You basically have the fishery management, it's changed now, but at this point the picture was taken, the fishery management is impeding habitat development. You know, my advice in this particular scenario would be, let's move the path back from the river so you're not mowing so close, and let's stop cutting the fringe, and maybe let's plant a few trees as well, or at least let trees develop of their own accord. The other advice would be, let's deal with the impounding effect of the hatches to try and pull a bit more flow through this bit of river so that we end up cleaning up the gravel. This was taken in, I think, in about 2008. It's actually on the Wildlife Trust Reserve. It's at Abbott's Barton. Again, this is actually before a river restoration project. I'm afraid I don't have an aftershot, but what you have is what I've explained earlier. You have a very simple habitat. You have basically a box-shaped channel. The fishery management has facilitated easy casting. And what you have is basically a sediment-filled chalk ditch. The good news is this has been addressed. There has been a river restoration take place. The management of the fringes, the mowing is done a lot more sensitively. And actually, I'm sorry I don't have another picture of this, but if you took a picture from this place now, you'd hardly see the river because it would just be covered in vegetation. It would be so tall, there'd be trees growing everywhere. It's actually a lot different than when this picture was taken. So what happened here was, I think the old fishing club left, and then the Wildlife Trust took over stewardship of it. And I think with the Piscatorial Society involved as well, the fishing club, they managed the habitat a lot more sensitively, and better habitat developed because of that. So how to fix the ongoing issues? So we've talked about the fencing quite a bit. This is on the Bourne Rivulet. They might be in the room. Some of the volunteers do some invertebrate sampling here as well. And I've actually heard that it's pretty good results here as well. So we had an unfenced bit of river. You can see the old fence there. There's one fence post left. This was sheep grazed. So the sheep grazed it right up to the river's edge. And what you had because of it was you had a few patches of nettles growing, a tiny bit of cress and mint in the edge of the river, and grass, basically, and nothing else growing. But you put a fence up 10 meters back, ends up looking like that. What happened was we put the fence up 10 meters back, had a really good landowner. He completely got it. He was like, as long as the sheep have got water, I don't mind what you do. And so we agreed 10 meters. We have done a little bit of tree planting in here too. You can hardly see it with all the vegetation that's grown up now. But what was interesting is within 8 months, you had flowers coming up in there that you never had before. And within 2 years, you had little trees and saplings starting to grow in there. And the habitat is still developing even now. The interesting point is, what do you do with this? Well, I think at the moment it looks amazing. It should be just left as is. But if you do no management to this strip, which at the moment there is no management, you may end up with it filling in with scrub, for example, like blackthorn, hawthorn, which isn't necessarily bad in small clumps. But if you did nothing for 40 or 50 years, you may end up with just a very tree-lined bit of river that then overshades the river. So there is a point at which you have to do something. And obviously at the moment, nothing's going on here because we've got really good habitats that have developed. So what we did was in the fencing was we created gateways so that either machinery could come in and manage the vegetation in the future, or we've talked about putting grazing animals in there sporadically to knock back the vegetation to keep the good habitats developing. So put a couple of cows in for a day or two, get them out. They'll suppress the vegetation a bit and also trample in the seeds and you can then maintain what is good. So dogs and public footpaths, as I said, this is a hard one to address. Watercress and winterbournes. This is the Anton. Some of you might recognize it if you're Andover folk. This is Rooksbury Mill. This is a really good example. I use this all the time as to what to do next to a footpath, because what this is actually dog fencing. If that fence wasn't there, you wind back to the picture I showed you previously, which was on the Itchen, which was basically just mud. The river would not look like this if the fencing wasn't there. It would probably be a lot more eroded, because that's what happens next to a footpath. You have dogs and people, and you end up depleting the habitats because they are very, very sensitive. What you actually have behind here is there's actually water voles in here and all sorts of insects, and obviously it's providing really good food for the fish. And you also have a really nice reach of the River Anton as well. So the dogs can still swim in the lake here, for example, but in the river, it is actually excluded from the public and the dogs. So what you really have here is you have a refuge basically for voles and fish behind here, and also everyone can see it, which I think is a really nice thing. This was a watercress and winterbournes project. So this last year, some of you might have seen, we did a project up at Flashettes at Overton on the River Test. This is what it looked like before. When I first went there, you had dog and people erosion, and you can see it here, and it's created a very simple habitat. You have a very shallow river. I mean, it's incredibly shallow. You could walk across that in walking boots, to be honest, because it's so over wide. And you have a depletion of what I would call good trout habitat. So we embarked on a project in partnership with the Watercress and Winterbournes and the landowners. There's three landowners here, to shore up the footpath, but also to create areas where the public could get to the river and still use it, but also to exclude them from a few areas where the habitat had been degraded further. What we did here was we created a matrix of woody material. So you can see the logs laid in here near of shot. And then we used some local gravel, so some cobble, to pack in behind the logs to sort of harden up the entrance so that when people and dogs go into the river, it doesn't erode the bank, basically. And so this is kind of the work in progress. That shows you what I think we put 120 tons of gravel into the river here. So that is quite a lot. A lorry load is 20 tons. So about 5 or 6 lorry loads of gravel we put in here. And then you can see the guys there working in the background. They are reducing the tree shading to light the channel so that we get those favorable habitats developing. What we had here was a very old sycamore woodland that had trees of a very similar age. So we coppiced some of them to allow some light to the river, to hopefully get those favorable habitats developing, like reeds and ranunculus were sort of our target species. And then that's how it finished up looking. We had a nice gravel beach, you could call it. You can see it's narrowed the flow right up there, and you've now got quite a fast flow coming through here with a little bit of a meander as it kinks through. The river flows away from us and then to the right there. The tree shading's been reduced, and no complaints, so I've heard. So I think it was well received by the public, and they've actually really enjoying the river. And also with Watercress and Winterbournes, we did a lot of education behind this and educating people about the river and how sensitive it is. So actually there's a little interpretation board been put up here to basically just say that the river's a sensitive place and just try and look after it as much as you can. So we'll go to hands-off maintenance. We talked a little bit about that. Some of you will recognise this probably. Mottisfont Abbey. I think it was about 2 years ago. where we did a series of reports on the river and how the management was in some ways suppressing good habitat development. And this is by no means a sort of groundbreaking thing. And there's been some much better stuff done on the estate. And then 2 years later, it looked like that. And that picture is in the same place. They reduced cutting of the marginal fringe. And again, you can relate this back to your gardens if you've got gardens. If your garden is mown, tightly mown, try not mowing. And you might end up with the edge of the river looking like this, where you've got some nice reeds, you've got bits of flowering vegetation, good for pollinators, good for insects, good for fish. What that shows is basically by saying, I'm going to be lazy and do nothing, you get really good stuff happening, particularly if you have been managing it. This is on Mottisfont too. If you have trees fall into the channel, as I mentioned earlier, they create really good habitat niches. And what has happened downstream of it, you can see there right in the middle of the shot, the sort of beige gravel that's been washed out from underneath the trees. So the flow has hit those trees, it's been driven underneath the trees, and then the riverbed has moved. You've got a really deep hole that's cut underneath the trees, really good for fish to hide in amongst, take refuge from predators. And then downstream of it, you've got this bank of gravel, and that has possibly provided good habitat for spawning fish, because you have this clean, loose gravel, and the river is oxygenating the gravel because it's pushing through it. And so by basically saying, do you know what, when a tree falls in, we're going to leave it alone, you've created really, really good habitat. And obviously, if you took those trees out, I'll tell you what would happen. The riverbed would flatten out and the pool would disappear, and you'd end up with a flat riverbed again. So by basically managing trees, you're often simplifying the habitat, making it less habitable for certain niches of insect or fish. Simple message, simple habitat, low fish diversity. So if you have that complicated habitat, like the picture before, you get good fish diversity. If you have it simplified, you get poor. A different picture. What you have is you have a tree that's fallen into the channel. It's washed out the gravel underneath. And you can see in the middle of the channel there, the gravel that's been pushed out from underneath the tree. So you have a deep hole, lots of refuge, lots of areas where fish can hang out. You've got spawning, you've got a deep hole, and you've also have a deep channel on the left-hand side of the picture there, which would be really good habitat for large fish. So you're catering for all the life stages just almost in this one picture. And I think that's why we use it quite a lot, because it's just a really good example of what you do when you do nothing. What you can do when the river's poor. A slightly extreme example, but this was actually done a month ago. This is on the River Kennet. We had a really simplified channel, no trees in the river. The river was actually quite fast flowing. It was very flat, and the riverbed was not varying at all. So you could almost just wade the whole way along the river. It didn't really come much above your knee or thigh, and that was it the whole way along. So what we embarked upon was a habitat restoration here. We did this with Action for the River Kennet. And so we coppiced a load of alder. You can see we wedged the trees actually in amongst the old tree stumps. And those trees are not dead. They're going to regrow. It's sometimes good to coppice trees, particularly if you've got a lot in a certain area, which we did have upstream of here, which you can't see out of shot on the left. So we've then laid the trees in, and then we've graded the bank down and uprooted a couple of hawthorn trees that you can see they're just slightly right of shot. What we have is we have a sort of matrix of trees in the channel and uprooted trees. The river is driving underneath the trees, and it's actually washed out a load of gravel at the back of them. Those trees on the right of shot there are those trees. So that shot is that in the air. Downstream of those trees, so that the river is flowing from the bottom of the picture to the top of the picture, you can see the gravel that has been washed out from under the trees. And this is only after a week. So we had some flooding while just after we did the work, and the river came up a foot. And what happened was it drove this bank of gravel downstream, and it's actually created this really strong riffle downstream now. So the river's actually got shallower downstream and deeper where the wood is. What that's created is good habitat for adult fish in the deeper area, and good habitat for spawning fish at the back of the structure where the gravel's been washed out, and probably good juvenile habitat on the shallow water as well. In just 2 hours work with a digger and a few guys with a chainsaw, we've created some really, really interesting habitat there. It's just another shot. This is on the Bourne rivulet. So it kind of shows you what we have to do to get habitat into the river, sometimes in a slightly more larger scale way. So when you have a habitat that is a bit depleted of tree cover, it's very difficult to often move trees to where you want them. But what it kind of shows you is how extreme you can get with your habitat introductions. This is another watercress windspawns area. So this is slightly smaller scale than the previous example, but this is a large ash tree that's been felled opposite, moved there with an excavator, and then you can see the gravel's actually been added to it in the left of shot. So that we've keyed it into the bank with gravel to pinch the channel up there, and the bank's actually been lowered. So if you have a very high bank, you can get unfavorable plants developing on the high bank, whereas if you lower the bank and make it nearer to water level and squishier, so wetter, boggier, you often get more favorable habitats developing, like the chalk stream plants we love, like flag iris, for example. They love the boggy ground. And again, what's happened is the river's driven underneath the tree and it's scoured out a bank of gravel here at the bottom of the shot, and it's created quite a deep hole actually on the right hand side of the picture there as well. So it's just created really interesting habitat. This is actually something anybody can do. It's called tree hinging. So we liken it to hedge laying. You might have seen hedge laying before. These are goat willow, and they are cut through with a chainsaw partially and then laid over, so the tree is kept alive, and that tree is laid into the river channel. The best thing about this, it is instant habitat. So you're basically laying a tree into the channel, and the tree is kept alive as well. So you're not even, the tree doesn't die. So you basically have a living refuge of a tree that's in the river that will carry on growing, because willow does that. It's just such a simple, easy thing to do. And also, you don't necessarily have to do it with a chainsaw. You can do it with hand tools. This sort of pruning saws, the modern pruning saws, are really good at doing it as well. So it is something anybody can do. This tree near of shot here, at the bottom of the screen, is actually that hinge, and that's the tree just laid in the channel. And you can see, you'd hardly notice that it had happened by the hand of man. It would look really, really natural, and that's the look we often go for. Slightly more extreme example here. So you could say, well, it looks like a bomb's hit the place. Well, this is what that bank lowering can look like. So the bank was very high. It was regraded, so it was made lower and boggier. The profile of the bank is a lot more gradual than it used to be. And then 1 year later, it looks like that. So you can see how quickly the river can recover from what basically looks like open heart surgery on it. It can really recover very, very quickly. So the reason it recovered quickly is because we harvested all the plants off the old bank before we lowered it, and then we replaced the new bank with the plants on top. And then obviously we've done a little, you can see we've done a little bit of tree planting there as well. It's an incredible turnaround from what it was. And also, when it was a very steep bank, you had nowhere near as many of these marginal plants in there. It's really increased the diversity of that river channel. This again is a really extreme example of some, you could call it large woody material. So This tree was upended with an excavator. It's ash, it's dying, it's got dieback. But what we have done here is we've laid the trunk of the tree into the channel, which has kind of created a bit of a cave. You often can walk up here and fish will just spook under the tree. The ends of the tree are completely covering the channel, which means a fisherman can't get to them, which is a good thing in my view, because a lot of this river, as you can see, is open. And so having areas like this where you have refuge, where fish can hide, is really important. So what's important about fishing for wild trout in a sensitive way is catch and release. You can also liken that to resting fisheries as well. So as we've touched upon, they're sensitive environments. If you trample up and down them all the time, you're going to disrupt wildlife. So probably have the fishery not fished so often. And when you catch fish, treat them with respect and put them back in a really sensitive way so that someone else can catch them. The finest gift you can give to any fisherman is to put a good fish back. And who knows if that fish you caught isn't someone else's gift to you. So when you are landing a fish or when you are fishing, make sure you have everything at the ready. For example, a pair of unhooking tools, so forceps or disgorger, and your camera ready, not tucked away in the bottom of your bag so that the fish is flapping around on the bank, you know, gasping for air, basically. Use barbless hooks. So they come out very, very easily. You can literally just pull them out with your finger. You often don't need an unhooking tool if you have a barbless hook. The only time you might need an unhooking tool is if it's in a difficult place on the fish and you might need a little bit of assistance. But generally with barbless hooks, they just fall out really, really easily. Really low impact. Also, when you're playing the fish, make sure you play it quickly. Don't linger within the fight. Don't hold the fish up in the water and look for your camera while you're trying to get it in. Get it in the net, quick and easy. When you touch the fish, obviously the main thing to do is try and not touch it, because anytime you touch fish, you're stressing it basically. If you do have to touch a fish, wet your hands before you touch it, because you know they're a cold-blooded animal. So you should really be in their environment when you're touching them. So when you net the fish, keep the fish in the water, unhook it. If you then have to prepare it for a picture, make sure the fish is lying in the water, not out the water, flapping around on the riverbank, because that is going to stress it. It may kill it. Just an example of a fish. This is actually on the Bourne Rivulet. This is a Bourne Rivulet wild trout caught just near Hurstbourne Priors. You may say, oh, the fish is out of water. It's not actually. Look at the hand. The hand is underwater. The fish is lying on the net in a reed bed, and the fish is actually in the water. This fish was photographed like this, and then it was released a couple of seconds later. But also what's important about keeping it in the water is the fish is still breathing as well. So this fish swam off strong as anything. This is the example I have of what you can get if you get really good habitat and fishing fished in a sensitive way. This fish, he's got a name. He's called the Sergeant. He was caught over 3 consecutive years by 2 different anglers. And often each time he was caught, he was about a pound heavier. So I think in 2019, he was about sort of 3 and a bit pounds. And the last time he was caught was in 2022, and he was nearly 6 pounds in weight. And again, you can see the fish is in the water. He's in the net. He's in the edge of the river. And again, he's been released. And actually, after this one, I think was the 2021 picture, he was caught a year later, about half a mile from where he was caught the first time. So what it shows you is they can be caught and released without a lot of harm, and they still grow and live a really good life. And also, the fish will breed and spawn, and its offspring will be incredibly important to that river system, particularly if you've got a fish of this caliber in the river because its genes will be very, very strong for survival. So that's what's important about that. And that's the end.